The choir was founded initially 2 years ago to sing services as a visiting choir in Peterborough Cathedral, but last year we decided to begin the choir's next phase and take it into a more professional setup. The Assumption has not really been given much attention in terms of discography, so we decided that it would be quite fun to bring some of the repertoire for this rather interesting and curious feast to light, and in particular to draw upon repertoire that isn't very often performed or has been neglected, and bring it back, hopefully slightly into the mainstream. We decided to record in the beautiful surroundings of the Guild's Chapel here in the centre of historic Stratford-upon-Avon, a chapel that has close associations with William Shakespeare and his family, but also possesses the marvellous and thrilling new organ by Principal Pipe Organs of York. This is the first recording to have taken place in these beautiful surroundings for some time. We've also enjoyed being able to gaze upon the extraordinary frescoes in the chapel depicting the apocalypse in quite vivid and gory detail. The Assumption has really captured the hearts of some of the finest composers out there. It was very central to medieval Catholicism. It was particularly popular in Italy and played an important part in the Counter-Reformation as being a uniquely Catholic feast. There isn't any scriptural justification per se of the feast. It's purely based on the tradition of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary into heaven. Similarly echoing the Ascension of Jesus, much more well-known feast, the Assumption celebrates both the glorious triumph of Mary being assumed up into the clouds, also her coronation as the Regina Caeli, the Queen of Heaven, but also the more sombre note of her departure from earth. So there's a huge scope of variety for composers to indulge in and to try and bring to the fore.
So the CD is structured as a mass for the feast and an evensong, with the complete music for both services. The first half of the CD contains the Mass by Pendylotta for the Feast of the Assumption. We have a motet by Palestrina for the same feast, Assumpta es Maria, and the plain song propers as well for the Mass. We also have the evensong, which has a Mendelssohn anthem, a setting of the Ave Maria, which is more what most English choirs are familiar with when paired with Jackson in G, a wonderful 20th century setting of the Magnoke.
A well-known choral conductor of my acquaintance once said that a recording session is a bit like a taxi ride through central London. Sometimes you're making good progress, sometimes you're stopped still, not going anywhere, but all the time the meter's running. It's a question of keeping an eye on the time to make sure that you're going to get through everything, but at the same time making absolutely sure that every bar is as good as it can possibly be. so enjoyed working with this choir. It's full of talented and enthusiastic people singing such a wide range of music with a great deal of skill and understanding. And it's been a real pleasure getting to know them and getting to know their performance of this wonderful repertoire.
Well, a very good evening and a warm welcome to the launch event for Lyceac Choir's official debut CD, Assumpta Est Maria, music for the Feast of the Assumption. We're absolutely delighted this evening to be joined by Professor Owen Rees at the Faculty of Music, University of Oxford, and Father Nevsky Everett, Chaplain of Keble College, Oxford, both of whom will be providing us with some detail into the illuminating past of this extraordinary feast and some of the beautiful repertoire that lies on this CD ready for you to discover. Lyceac was established in 2017 as a cathedral visiting choir, but now we have turned our sights on more interesting and varied opportunities within the professional world, looking at how we might contribute to growing discourse in academic musicology on the reconstruction of historical liturgies, but also sticking firmly to our roots as a choir that produces music within a liturgical context. This CD reflects both of these values, being structured as a mass and an evensong for the feast. We provide the full music for the mass, all the propers, plain chant, introits, communion anthems, as well as a full mass setting. And then when we get to the evensong, you get the full range of the evensong service with the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis set to Francis Jackson's wonderful service in G, an exquisite anthem by Mendelssohn, responses, a hymn, and organ voluntaries as well, framing the disc. I'd now like to hand over to Father Nevsky. Father Nevsky is chaplain of Keble College, Oxford, a college that represents one of the Anglo-Catholic movement's great statements of faith. Nevsky read Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and Celtic at Gonville Keys College, Cambridge, before training for ordination at Westcott House. While reading theology, Nevsky learnt Syriac, and he is currently finishing a doctorate on the cross in the writings of Isaac the Syrian. It's very good to have you with us this evening, Father. Thank you very much. I wonder if you could begin by just briefly describing the key characteristics and major historical facts that surround this very, very interesting feast, and perhaps cast some light on why it's a feast that's acquired, that's gained so much controversy.
Thank you. Well, so the Feast of the Assumption, the idea of Mary being taken up body and soul into heaven is a very ancient one, and its origins are lost in the mist of time. Nobody really knows when the cult of Mary began in the Christian church, but clearly it's an early date. Constantine is said to have built 3 churches dedicated to Mary in his new capital of Constantinople before his death in the 330s. And there was a church dedicated to Mary at the time of the Council of Ephesus in 431. And it's that council which promotes her title Theotokos, God-bearer. So it's a very ancient tradition. The particular liturgical celebration of the Assumption of Mary, similarly, is a bit murky when it comes to its origins. But the tradition pre-exists the liturgical commemoration. And so there are some apocryphal texts which begin to think about what happened when she died, which date to sort of the 3rd and 4th century. So again, it's a very ancient feast tradition. By 570, there was a church near Gethsemane in Jerusalem, which was supposed to be on the site of the tomb from which Mary was taken into heaven. So again, that's an early date. The liturgical commemoration, known as the falling asleep, the koimesis in Greek of Mary, it began in the East. The emperor decreed that the feast should be kept on the 15th of August, around the year 600. So note that he only specifies the date around that time. The feast itself may have pre-existed that date. So it originated in the East, but clearly caught on. By the 9th century, Pope Leo IV gave the feast an octave and a stational liturgy in Rome, which indicates the importance attached to it. And from then, it catches on in the West as well. There was a gradual shift away from the language of dormition, of falling asleep in the West, in line with the Greek use, towards the language of assumption, of being taken up. And that's how we know the feast today, but they're really the same. They have the same origin, and because in our modern time we think of it as such a Catholic feast, if you like, that we tend to think of it as somehow alien to Anglicanism. But it's worth noting that the deep rootedness in the patristic tradition means that the belief in the Assumption is reflected in a number of the Protestant reformers. The evidence from the reformers is hotly contested in various internet fora, as you might imagine. But there is, I think, enough evidence to suggest that at least some of them believed that, or Mary was in some way taken into heaven, including Heinrich Bullinger, who was Zwingli's successor in Geneva. So not insignificant evidence that this belief was maintained at the Reformation. In terms of the Church of England, the Anglican calendars of 1549 and 1552 removed all feasts of Mary, with the exception of the Annunciation and the Purification, because of their biblical connections. 3 Marian feasts were restored in 1561, but the Assumption wasn't among them, so it was gone from the Anglican calendar from 1549. In the Catholic Church, obviously the tradition continued, and it was made dogma by Pope Pius XII in 1950, and it's enjoyed a surge in popularity since then. But it's worth noting that with the advent of common worship in 2000, the 15th of August was designated as the festival of the Blessed Virgin Mary in the Church of England. So it avoids the language of Assumption, but if you look at the material, that's clearly what is being borne in mind here. But you'll have to buy the CD and read the booklet if you want my thoughts on that particular aspect.
Yes. Just before we move on to just discuss a little bit more about this unease that exists, perhaps within the Church of England towards the Feast of the Assumption, I wonder if you could perhaps suggest just why the Assumption as a feast seems to have acquired such particular popularity. I mentioned in the trailer that it became a really key part of dogma in the Counter-Reformation, but even before that, if we go to Italy, the number of major churches and cathedrals that are dedicated to the Assumption, and the clear number of cults that existed dedicated to the Assumption across Europe before the Reformation. It's even a devotional further that, dare I say it, perhaps is the same one experienced by some of the composers we've featured on this CD. But I wonder if you could perhaps account for that, and why it seems to have really caught the imagination of both composers and worshippers?
I think its popularity lies in its kind of fundamental theological conviction that in Mary's Assumption we see the glory that awaits us. You know, Mary is a human being like you and me. Here we see her taken into the glory of heaven, and so we see in Mary the fulfillment of Christ's work, and we know that that's where we're headed, and that's a glorious thing. So I think that accounts for its widespread popularity.
Absolutely. So yes, I mean, we've kind of almost sort of dug ourselves into a bit of a theological hole in the disc by offering an evensong for Assumption Day, which I'm sure will raise plenty of eyebrows among certain communities within the Church of England. However, of course, you know, it's very legitimately something that you may well find in an Anglo-Catholic parish or leaning cathedral. But I wonder if you could perhaps account a little bit for this unease as well, this antipathy that exists even today among a lot of Church of England clerics towards the Assumption and indeed towards Marianism.
Yeah. I think that's clearly the case, and I note that the collect used on the disc is not an authorised liturgy of the England.
Indeed, yes.
So evensong purists will notice that. But obviously the feast was extremely popular in pre-Reformation England, just as elsewhere, and even today there are something like 20 parish churches which still carry the pre-Reformation dedication to the Assumption of Mary, which it was, when I looked it up, it was more than I had thought. And because it was such an important part of patristic thinking, we can't get away from it. It is embedded in our history. But you're right, there is some ambivalence. I think perhaps it's seen as a bit too baroque, perhaps a bit un-English, maybe. I know that at least one of those churches dedicated to the Assumption has recently tried to have its legal dedication changed to St Mary's. So you're right that there was a lot of unease, and I think because of its popularity in Roman Catholic circles since 1950, there's a sense in which it's seen as other or perhaps extreme.
Extended that divide a bit. That's very, very interesting. I mean, do we think that more of a sort of general point? Obviously, Mary was perhaps equally important in pre-Reformation England as she was on the continent, where we really, really associate with cults. But we see there's so much evidence, even during the years of the Reformation, that the cult of Mary was still maintained, and the Assumption was a key part of that. Is it purely to do with the Reformation, do you think, that we gained this unease, or was that exploiting? Were the reformers exploiting something? Perhaps if you could touch on this idea of Englishness that helped them to wash away these great Marian feasts with the publication of prayer books.
I think it's a very thorough consequence of the Reformation agenda. Devotion to Mary was extremely strong in pre-Reformation England. England was the dowry of Mary.
Yes, exactly.
The little office of the Blessed Virgin was prayed all across, part of a very thorough attempt by the reformers to tone things down a bit, with general unease with the cult of the saints. But of course, they couldn't get rid of it completely because of the biblical witness. And if we take Scripture seriously, not only do we have the gospel passages in which Mary features prominently, we also have the woman crowned in Revelation as well. And so there's no escaping.
Yes. Exactly. Yes. But I mean, that being said, when we still see quite a lot of very pronounced, I don't want to say sects, but groups of Anglicans who are absolutely dedicated, hand and soul, to Marian worship. are there any hints that Mariology is gaining perhaps slightly more greater prominence with the advent of common worship within the Church of England today? I mean, for example, Justin Welby visited Walsingham for the first time in many, many years, I think, for certainly for him in 2019, and very happily celebrated Mass of around 20,000. Where does that leave us, I suppose, with where she might end up within Church of England theology?
I mean, I think the point about Archbishop Justin's visit to Walsingham for the national pilgrimage in May 2019 is a very interesting one, because later in the year, on the 15th of August, the Archbishop tweeted twice about celebrating the hashtag Assumption of Mary, which did draw the ire of some commentators.
That's a hashtag I think we've probably used in some of our marketing. Hopefully not to the same degree of controversy.
And obviously, that there is a reasonable debate about whether or not we technically celebrate the Feast of the Assumption in the Church of England. But the fact that the Archbishop's tweets highlight for many Anglicans that it is part of the lived tradition and experience of faith, of the life of the Church. And I think the Archbishop's visit did make that visible. I mean, I don't know what Mary's place in the Church of England will look like going forward, but I suspect there will always be those who wish to downplay the Catholic tradition in the Church of England, as there will always be those who seek to promote it. The only thing I would add is that in 2016, the Sodality of Mary, Mother of Priests, was founded, of which I'm a member, and it's a dispersed community of priests, men and women, formed by a Marian spirituality. And it's grown a lot in the last year, particularly over the pandemic, and has members across the Anglican communion. So I hope the Sodality, for instance, can be a vessel for renewal in the Church, particularly in its call for us to be more like the Mother of God.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very, very much, Father, for those truly wonderful insights and comments on the sort of awkward position that both this feast and indeed our CD might occupy within the Church of England's tradition. We're now going to invite Professor Rees to shed a few more thoughts on some of the repertoire in the CD itself. Owen Rees is Professor of Music and Prior Lecturer at the University of Oxford and Fellow in Music and Organist at the Queen's College. He directs the renowned chapel choir of Queen's College and also conducts the professional early music ensemble Contrapunctus. His recordings have 3 times been shortlisted for the Gramophone Early Music Award, have been selected as Editor's Choice in Gramophone and Choral and Song Choice in BBC Music magazine, and featured in the 20 Classical Recordings of the Year 2015 in the Sunday Times. His interpretations of early music have been acclaimed as rare examples of scholarship and musicianship, combining to result in performances that are both impressive and immediately attractive to the listener. As a scholar, Owen has published widely on many of the foremost Renaissance composers, including Josquin, Morales, Guerrero, Victoria, and Byrd. He is renowned as one of the world's foremost authorities on Iberian Renaissance music and appears regularly on BBC Radio 3 in discussions of the early music. His most recent major book, published by Cambridge University Press, is a study of Victoria's famous Requiem of 1603 and of the whole genre of polyphonic requiem music in the late Renaissance and early Baroque. It's very good to have you with us this evening, Professor. So at the sort of musical centerpiece of our CD is the first mixed choir release of the Missa Ave Maria Peregrina by the late 15th century Spanish composer Francisco da Peñalosa. Little is known about Peñalosa's life, and his output consists of, I think, around 6 extant masses and approximately 30 or so motets, combined with some more smaller scale pieces of repertoire and a few passions and lamentations. I wonder, Professor, if you could just describe, tell us a little bit more about Peñalosa's life, and perhaps just sort of touch on his significance, not least within the Iberian world, but what he perhaps contributed to the world of late 15th century polyphony.
Indeed. So we know where he was born, Talavera de la Reina, but then we lose sight of him until he gains employment in one of the 2 royal chapel choirs. So this is the period of the unification of the two principal Spanish kingdoms, Aragon and Castile, resulting from the marriage of the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. So it's an extraordinary time of increased political unification and therefore, if you like, clout for the Spanish kingdoms. And as one might expect, the chapel choirs of the monarchs of Castile and Aragon are magnets for many of the finest musicians in the peninsula. And Peñalosa works for Ferdinand, so he's working as a singer in the Aragonese royal chapel. But in fact, these two great chapel choirs would often have combined forces as the monarchs made their way around their kingdoms in performance. So most of Peñalosa's career is spent as a singer in Ferdinand's choir, and he remains in that employment until Ferdinand's death in the 1510s. In the meantime, and through Ferdinand's good offices, a canonry at Seville Cathedral has been secured for Peñalosa, and this is one of the ways in which Renaissance singers made a living, that they would acquire canonries in cathedrals, perhaps local to them, perhaps not. But sometimes these appointments aroused controversy because the singers concerned were not present to serve the cathedral concern. So, in fact, Seville Cathedral resisted Peñalosa's holding of this canonry and receiving the salary for the stipend for it for many years. Peñalosa does nevertheless visit Seville after Ferdinand's death. He's briefly living there. But then quite soon he gains employment in the household chapel of the Pope Leo. And so he's in Rome until the death of the Pope. And he's the first of a string of among most prominent Spanish composers of the Renaissance who spend part of their career in Rome or elsewhere in Italy. And so we have Morales is the next famous case. And indeed, Peñalosa and Morales may be connected because Morales' origins in Seville make it quite likely that, well, some claim that Peñalosa was Morales' teacher. I think certainly they would have had some musical contacts. And Morales goes on a couple of decades later, likewise, to hold a singer's position in the papal choir, the choir of the Sistine Chapel. So after the death of the Pope, Peñalosa does take up his canonry at Seville, and it's in Seville where he dies in 1528, and in fact he's buried in Seville Cathedral. And then you asked about his significance. He's very well represented in the manuscripts of Spanish polyphony of this period, the most important of which is a manuscript now in Tarazona. It's possible that manuscript originated at Seville Cathedral. There's some evidence that points in that direction, but there's a bit of a debate among scholars about its origins. And manuscripts such as that show that he was the most successful and most renowned composer of the group of composers who were, in most cases, working for the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, as members of their royal chapels. So the repertory is, by the standards of Spanish survivals of polyphony of the period, relatively generous. As you say, we have 6 masses, one of which is the Missa Ave Maria Peregrina, which is on the new CD. We have, for example, a mass based on the tune L'Homme Armé, the Armed Man, which was a favourite tune on which to write a mass and had been for decades before this in the north of Europe. And we have some masses with intriguing titles, the Missa El Ojo, which we're not sure why that title. We have a mass on a song by Johannes Rieder, or de Urede, as he was known in Spain, a northerner who worked in Spain, Nunca fue pena mayor. And so we have two masses based on that tune. The other is by one of the northerners who came to visit Spain during Peñalosa's career, Pierre de la Rue. We have several Magnificat settings, which use the chant, and as you say, a good number of motets, not dominated by Marian texts, in fact, the motets by texts which evoke Holy Week or a penitential or both. So they're often these very evocative uh, uh, picturings of Christ's suffering or of our penitence. And then we have a number of songs in Castilian as well.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much indeed for introducing us a little bit more to Peñalosa, and hopefully for those watching, please do go and have a listen to his other works as well. They are not many recordings, and hopefully we are sort of adding to the collection of that. But he is an absolutely fascinating composer. And I wonder if we could just zoom in a little bit on the Mass itself and just sort of look at how well it stands up as a piece in its own right in comparison, although of course difficulties with comparison, but how well it fits into the sort of narrative of late 15th century Europe at this time, and the Mass writing. In particular, I think the Mass, for me, has one of my favourite Agnus Deis of this entire period, the Agnus 2, but also the Agnus 1 with its unique 3 alto scoring and bass. They're very, very emotional and extremely, extremely beautiful, and I think reflecting a sort of a contrapuntal ingenuity that I think perhaps certainly puts Peñalosa up in the highest sort of estimation. So I wonder if we could just dwell a bit on that Agnus Dei with the canon that we get, the retrograde of the chanson, and how this compares to what was going on at the time in the rest of Europe.
Indeed. So there's already in Peñalosa's period emerging a tradition that you make Agnus Dei settings, and particularly if you set more than one invocation of the Agnus, somehow climactic. So in the case of the final Agnus of this Mass, he adds a voice part, and that's quite common practice and remains so for the rest of the Renaissance. But not just climactic, but a technical showcase of some kind. So if you're going to do canon at only one place in a polyphonic Mass ordinary cycle in the Renaissance, the Agnus is the prime site for that. And as you say, we have this intriguing device in the final Agnus of the Missa Ave Maria, where the sacred and the secular apparently are combined contrapuntally with one another. So we have the Salve Regina chant counterpointed with the tenor part of a polyphonic song by Hein van Griesegheim, De Tout bien plein. But Palestrina is not satisfied with showing how those two will fit together, because he presents the song tenor in retrograde. So this is reminiscent of the kinds of showing off technically that one finds, for example, in the Agnus Dei settings of some of the Josquin masses. Famous examples in one of Josquin's Missa l'Homme Armé, where again we get a melody presented different time values or retrograded in this kind of trick. I think the Mass as a whole, the Missa Ave Maria by Peñalosa, is intriguing in another way, in that it perhaps tells a bit of the story of how, in the words of Kenneth Kreitner in an article, Spain discovered the Mass, in other words, the cyclic polyphonic Mass. Because in tandem with quite a lot of other Spanish Masses this period, it looks as if it may have been a sort of combined Mass from elements that might have been composed as separate entities.
Yes.
We can't prove that, and it may have been a compositional decision on Peñalosa's part but the sign is that the movements, although chant-based, are based on different chants. So we have the Ave Maria chant presented as an ostinato at 2 different pitch levels, different phrases of it running through the Kyrie, and that presentation of a chant at 2 different pitch levels is again a technique that's quite familiar from Josquin. And then we have Mass ordinary chants used in the Gloria and the Credo, and so on. And so it's a sort of evocation of, in part, Marian, but in part not specifically Marian chant. So Of course, we don't know whether this combining of the 5 movements was done by Peñalosa, but it seems not unlikely that it was. But in some of these masses that are, if you like, shunted together from separate units in Spanish manuscripts of this period, it may have been the performers or the copyists that are doing this grabbing of movements from different composers even. So it just casts, it throws open a window on that gradual increasing sense of that the mass should be a cycle and a polyphonic cyclic form, in which process I think Spain was running a little bit behind the North Europe.
Absolutely. Yes. Of course, in certainly traditionally in musicology, and in normal historiography as well, we've looked at Spain as being a little bit of a provincial backwater, and that was certainly a view that persisted throughout much of the 20th century until we really get into the 80s and on from there. I just wonder what your sort of views are on this question and how far that applies to the music. As we've sort of alluded to, there really aren't many recordings of Spanish Renaissance, early Renaissance Spanish polyphony out there at the moment. Certainly not of things by Peñalosa, the first mixed choir recording in this way. Is that in itself a reflection of the subjective quality of the music, or is it to a reflection of the fact that we have simply underestimated the extent of how advanced some of these composers were in Spain at the time, and greatly underestimated their value to our narrative of how polyphony emerged on the continent in this period?
It's an interesting question. I think certainly the international familiarity with Spanish polyphony, with of course notable exceptions like certain Victoria's output, represented this tendency in scholarship to pinpoint, if you like, a centre or centres for the cultivation of polyphony in a particular period, and therefore peripheries. And the Iberian Peninsula did tend to be treated as one of those peripheries.
Yeah.
Well, there were things that, if you like, genuinely might have accounted for that. Spain did not have a flourishing music printing industry as early as centres like Rome or the Low Country cities like Antwerp. And so it was relatively more difficult for a Spanish composer to see their music widely disseminated. Now, some of Peñalosa's successors among Spanish composers made great use of music publishing. Morales, to quite a large extent, his pupil Guerrero, even more, partly because in Morales' case, as I said, he worked in Italy. That helped that process. In the case of Guerrero, he travelled to Italy to oversee publication of some of his music. And then Victoria, of course, spends pretty much half his career in Spain. But Peñalosa, you compare him with Josquin, for example. Josquin's music is becoming very widely published in the early decades of the 16th century, and that obviously contributes enormously to its contemporary fame. So I think there's no doubting from the manuscript evidence Peñalosa's fame within the peninsula, but interestingly, we don't find his music being preserved in Roman sources.
Yeah, exactly.
The singer in the papal chapel, that might just be a chance of source survival. In terms of the contemporary recognition, I think that it gradually has been gaining ground, Peñalosa's reputation in recorded sound from perhaps the 90s onwards. And again, Ken Kreitner published in Daily Music an article called Peñalosa on Record, where he marked a little bit of acceleration that was beginning round about then. So it's been a slow process, but I think that I was reading Tess Knighton's review of another Peñalosa disc from quite some time ago, and she had worked on Peñalosa for her doctorate and was principal specialist to him, and she says in that review, I was worried whether the music, when I heard it recorded, would stand up to my perception of it on the page, and she was so relieved that absolutely it did. This wasn't just beautifully crafted music on the page, but that all these wonderfully varied textual effects. For example, the little duos contrasting high and low voices, and the kinds of scoring contrasts that you mention come alive in recorded and live performance sound.
Hmm. Well, fantastic. Yes, I think that certainly from a performing point of view, the variation of the textures was something that we really tried to capture on disc. We had different groups of singers. We experimented a little bit with placement and that kind of thing. I think, well, hopefully people will agree when they listen that it's turned out quite well, but it certainly kept the singers on their toes, as some of this writing that certainly in the smaller parts is somewhat virtuosic, especially for poor altos. But yes, it's good to see that hopefully that we are adding something to this resurgence of enthusiasm for Pennylosa's output. And just one last bit, we sort of focused obviously on the Mass, which is our centerpiece, but of course we have a lot of other repertoire on the CD. And we've talked about with Nevsky the question of Anglican, Marian, or Assumption evensongs, and how you might try and do justice to Marian theology, which doesn't necessarily exist to a huge extent within the Church of England, in a particular evensong. And I just wondered, Professor, if you could perhaps talk to us a little bit about the Jackson in G evening service, which I think is quite regularly given in sort of Marian evensongs, and what your views are on how we can sort of tailor repertoire within the Anglican circuit, if you like, to these more Catholic feasts.
I suppose the Magnificat and Noctimittis are both texts that, although they're set so often, composers will often think afresh what both of those very vivid texts mean and how they might be evoked, either directly through scoring. I mean, so one tradition, of course, within Anglican settings of the Magnificat is that you begin with high voices.
Yeah.
And that's true of some of the house settings. So I think that the Jackson, I'd be interested to know, Jim, if this was one of the reasons that you chose it, has this very telling scoring at the start, with the top voice and the tenor in following each other closely, but both soaring immediately to pretty much the top of their range. This is a very broad arching melody, and certainly I think it's one of the most memorable opening evocations of that Canticle of Mary.
Yeah.
And then I suppose the other thing that is thought about afresh by each composer approaches the Magnificat is how to deal with what's an extraordinarily dramatic and gritty text. And it's easy to forget that, perhaps
through regularity, yes.
Song, but so yes, I'm particularly intrigued what it was about the Jackson that made you think this is one that's going to fit in very well to this.
Yeah, I think that it sort of captures the heart of the text in a way that is rather unique. As you say, we've got this interesting scoring at the start with the tenor and the soprano chasing each other, but there's a sort of real sense of naivety and innocence in the way that soprano line kicks off. It's very deliberately evocative of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who is pregnant with Christ, and exclaiming her joy of this. There's almost a real sense, not so much just of the historical depiction of this text, but almost of mimesis. So the sopranos become Mary in those opening lines. There is a sense that right from her start, that she, from the conception of Christ, she literally she's a character in the Bible who will ascend and grow, and shows how we can climb and rise up to better ourselves, and in so doing follow her son. And I think Jackson seems to perfectly emulate the significance of this text. So it's something, as you say, we kind of lose sight of, I think, a bit through the regularity of hearing it. But of course, it's of huge theological significance within the context of Luke's gospel, and a major focal point for the story. And yes, as I say, the Jackson perfectly encapsulates not just the sort of affect that you want for choral evensong, but also the literal meaning of the scripture, hinting perhaps at Mary's role throughout the Gospels and what she will go on to fulfill later on, and of course ascend into heaven in the Assumption. Brilliant. Well, I think that is all we have time for this evening, I'm afraid. But a huge thank you must go to our panelists for some truly insightful comments and illuminating discussions of the fascinating history behind this feast, a feast that is mired in controversy, but still generates such a popular response today from the most devoted of the faithful. You can, of course, buy our CD still on our website at www.luceatchoir.co.uk/hymnus -records. The CD is currently available for $14.99 plus postage and package. I'd like to just also take this time to draw your attention to our Sing Back Stronger campaign. Luceat, like many choirs around the world, has been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, not least from the emotional significance of not being able to perform together properly for such a considerable amount of time. And we're sort of hoping to use this period of regeneration as we ease out of restrictions to build back the choir's financial position, and in so doing allow us to establish ourselves more fully on the professional circuit, and also to provide much improved access schemes for sixth form young musicians, such as through choral and organ scholarships. These will be sort of mentorship schemes that will allow these young musicians, particularly targeted those from low-income backgrounds, to work with our musicians in our more professional context. You can find out more about that by also heading over to our websites on luceatchoir.co.uk/singbackstronger. And there are a number of ways with which you can get involved. You can become a friend of Luceat, a benefactor or patron. And we are also running a crowdfunder, giving you more flexibility with your donation. And that is specifically targeted towards a new CD that we will be recording in August of this year, all being well. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And once again, a huge thanks to our panel. We very much hope that you enjoy listening to this CD as much as we enjoyed rehearsing, performing and recording it. And I'd also like to pay particular tribute to those of you who supported our crowdfunder for this particular CD. Without you, this work simply would not have happened, and we wouldn't be in the very fortunate position of where we are today, of having a debut CD to share with you all. Thank you.